Fantastic. Um, so I'd like to, first of all, just to thank everybody for coming along. It is a beautiful day outside here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. We're really lucky at this time of late spring. And to begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I want to extend that acknowledgement and respect to all First Nations people across the Oceania region and to everyone in attendance here today. So today's overarching theme is going to be about RDA, obviously, but especially surrounding contributions from Oceania. Um, so we do have a couple of things to cover. We'll move through quickly, but if you do have any questions as I'm going, feel free to put them in the chat. There is time at the end for more questions, but as we are going, if anything particularly strikes you, just let me know and I'm happy to stop. So we'll start with a quick recap of RDA, just because we want to make sure that there are a couple of really important points that everyone is thinking about as we go through and talk more about this topic. Then we're going to look at the structure of the bodies that are responsible for RDA, so especially the RDA board and the RDA steering committee. From there, we're going to move down the hierarchy of structures, so to speak, and we're going to talk about the Oceania RDA Committee. That's us, so that's ORDAC. And then we are also going to look at a case study of an ORDAC proposal that reflects the needs of this Oceania cataloging community. And we can see how that is decided upon and how that goes up to the steering committee and how proposals are looked at. I'm then going to pass to my colleague Charlotte, and she's going to talk about the recent steering committee meeting in Washington. She's only been back in the country for a few days, so we do thank her for coming along today. And then we will also pass to Michela, who'll give us a quick update about what's going on with official RDA implementation in the Oceania region. And then at the end, I have set aside some more time for questions. But as I said, if you do have anything as we are going, just let us know. Before we jump into the actual content, I did want to give more of an official introduction for all of us. So my name is Jack, that's Jack EnnisButler, and I'm the backup Oceania RSC representative. I work at the National Gallery of Australia Research Library and Archives. And after me, you're going to hear from Charlotte Christensen. She is the Oceania RSC representative, and she is from the National Library of New Zealand and sits on ORDAC as the CATSIG representative. Finally, we will hear from Michela Goodwin. She's the chair of the Oceania RDA Committee, and she's from the National Library of Australia. So I just wanted to do a very, very quick recap of RDA. Obviously, everyone is familiar with RDA, and you've likely seen this definition, but I just wanted to mention a couple of things as we go. So RDA is a package of data elements, guidelines, and instructions for creating library and cultural heritage resource metadata that are well-formed according to international models for user-focused linked data applications. So it is a bit of a mouthful, this one, but I just wanted to point out that this is a content standard. So this is helping you generate descriptive metadata. We're not looking at administrative metadata. We're not looking at preservation metadata. We're really looking at that descriptive metadata, which is going to help users find, select, obtain, all that kind of tasks, the material that they are after. So it is really a user-focused standard. So we do want it to be appropriate for the users. So we always need to think about who our target audience is. It's also dynamic, so it's not a fixed tone that can no longer be touched. There are always proposals, there are always modifications, and that's just part of staying up to date. And it's also designed to be compatible with other standards in linked data environments. So, as collection description specialists, we know that out there are a wide range of standards, and RDA is designed in a way that it can be compatible with many of these. So taking advantage and really leveraging the new web environment that's out there. Just here, I quickly wanted to talk about a couple of things that RDA is not. So we know it's not the Anglo-American cataloging rules. We know it's not the second edition, but I just wanted to be really clear that RDA is not MARC, and it's definitely not BibFrame. So these are standards or data models that are used for encoding data. And this is different to the content standard, which is RDA. So we use these together, and you'll be familiar with this in your work. Some organizations will be using RDA content in MARC records. Others will be using RDA content in BibFrame records. Um, so it's just really important to separate out the two and just to make sure that, when we're talking about the introduction of BibFrame, this is a different thing to the introduction of, say, official RDA. Of course, there's going to be a lot of discussion about how these interact in the future and how they will be working together, but just keep it in mind as we go through. So RDA has been very rigorously built on a set of objectives and principles. And these have been derived from the International Federation of Library Associations Statement of International Cataloging Principles. And these have been really important in guiding the development of RDA. Um, but beyond that, they are also used by institutions for developing local policies, for looking at their policy statements. But they can also be used at a more local, almost individual level, so that when you are cataloging or when you are deciding on the procedures for your institution, um, you may need to refer back to these principles. So always thinking about your local context, who you're representing, um, and how these records are going to be helpful in this bibliographic universe. And I just wanted to mention that sometimes they may be in conflict, so it's always important to really think about what it is you're focusing on. Just a very quick mention of the history. Um, we said that these replace the Anglo-American cataloging rules, and there's a reason they are not the third edition. So there is a deliberate break with the preceding standards. So we recognized that the standards that were being used were no longer fit for purpose in this 21st century cataloging environment because things are moving so quickly. So it really is a conscious response to this changing cataloging environment, to the more and more new resources that we need to account for when we are describing material, to the technology that is available, but also to incorporate different conceptual models. And here I'm again thinking of IFLA's library reference model. And as we mentioned before, RDA is a dynamic standard, so it hasn't stood still. It has changed quite a bit. And the biggest change that you will have noticed, I'm sure, is that we have moved away from original RDA onto official RDA. Original RDA, it's well over 10 years old now. And so a lot has changed in that time. And so you're most likely to access official RDA through the wonderful RDA toolkit. Um, and the other thing I just wanted to flag on that toolkit, you may have heard talk of it, is that the countdown clock begins in May 2026. So this means that from this date, there will be a year, a countdown, until original RDA is removed from the toolkit. So it won't be accessible in the same way that it is now. And of course, it's envisaged that in this period, institutions will move towards implementing official RDA. And this is well underway. New Zealand's been doing wonderful things. DAC, the German-speaking regions in Switzerland, Austria, and Germany have got a great update, and you can check that out on the RDA YouTube channel if you're keen. And the United States of America is doing wonderful things as well. Michela is going to give us a quick overview of what's been happening in the Oceania region at the end too. So now that we've had a quick, recap of RDA and just touch bases there, I wanted to now talk a little bit about the RDA board. So this is the highest level of the structure. and they are responsible for setting the strategic direction of RDA. Essentially, they're the overarching body. They're responsible for the policies, the programs, the publishing, and more. So represented on the board are the copyright holders. These are the publishers of RDA and the RDA Toolkit, the American Library Association, the Canadian Federation of Library Associations, the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals. But in addition, there are more people on the board. For example, there is also the chair of the RDA Steering Committee, the director of the AIA's Digital Reference, and representatives from geographical regions. Now, this is really important because I just want to, emphasize that with the internationalization of RDA, regional voices are heard right at that highest level in the board. And so it's a really important chance to raise issues that we do have, and we can make sure that things from the Oceania region are discussed and that the board is aware of them. We're very well represented on the board by Julia Hickey, who's also from the National Library of Australia, and sits with us on ORDAC. So below the board, we have the RDA Steering Committee. So this is authorized by the RDA board. It falls under their jurisdiction. And this is the body that is responsible for maintaining the standard. So people are often asking, who is writing RDA, who is coming up with all of the content in the toolkit? And this is a group, this is a steering committee. So it includes working groups as well. So we've got the translations working group, the examples working group, the technical working group. They're establishing an archives working group as well. And just like the board, it includes regional representatives and other positions such as office bearers. But again, I wanted to emphasize here that with the regional representatives, this means that we are able to make sure that the decisions that are being made about the content in the toolkit, about the content in the standard, are appropriate for the Oceania context, that they meet the needs of the cataloging communities that we do have here. So the steering committee meets 4 times per year, including once in person. And this is where they debate proposals and they have some really vigorous discussion about the topics. What's interesting in this case is that each meeting has got a public session. The agenda is circulated in advance. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to attend, just depending on the time frame. So keep in mind it might be an early morning. But this can be a really fantastic opportunity to look at the kind of questions that are being asked and to listen to the views that are being expressed, as well as there is a chance to ask questions from the floor. So if anyone is interested in this, I'd highly recommend going along to these public sessions. Attending the public sessions online. So the next step down, so to speak, is the Oceania RDA Committee. So this is us, this is ORDAC. So this was created back in 2018 by Lianza's Cataloging Special Interest Group and the Australian Committee on Cataloging. So we'll be more familiar with the terms CATSIC and ACORD today. So sitting on ORDAC, we have the representatives from these cataloging communities, including their representatives from the National Library of New Zealand and the National Library of Australia. But we also have observers from institutions that may not have adopted RDA, but have a stake in the introduction of the standard, and co-opted members like me from other institutions. Now, currently, we do only have members from New Zealand and Australia, but we are actively seeking input from other regions of Oceania. So if you do know someone who may be interested, or if you are interested yourself, think about approaching us to have a conversation about the kind of input that we can take on board. So on our page on the RDA website, we have our terms of reference. Now, I just wanted to highlight a couple of key points that are really relevant to what we're talking about today, to put in perspective how we are able to contribute from our region. So this first one is contribute positively to the development of RDA by disseminating information and seeking feedback on RDA and RDA development. and the next represent the interests of RDA users in the Oceania region on the RSC. So I think these 2 points are really, really essential and go right to the center of what it is that we do. So on one hand, we're bringing information that is out there in the RDA universe, what is being discussed at meetings, what is changing, and we're able to disseminate that within the region. But on the other hand, we're taking views from the floor, from the people who are working with collections, with communities, and with material, and relaying what they encounter and what issues they have back up to these administrative bodies. And so this is a chance where we can take feedback and we can make change happen in RDA. So a really good example from this year is ORDAC's dual language naming corporate body in place proposal. Now, Charlotte did some incredible work on this one, so we would like to thank her for this, putting together such a comprehensive proposal. And basically, this is a situation where a single string for a corporate body or a place contains 2 or more languages used together and used in the same string. So this is where it's not interpreted as parallel language values. The content in one language is not a substitute for the content in the other language. It's a single string and is normally interpreted as such. So one of the examples that we had in the proposal is the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa. And this is normally presented like this as a single string. So in the current RDA instructions, there was no adequate provision for this kind of data as a preferred name. So ORDAC was able to listen to the feedback from the community, investigate the issue, and came up with a solution, which was creating a new condition and condition option for preferred name of corporate body and preferred name of place, and proposing that this be added to the RDA standard. This was put out to the other members of the steering committee, and it was very, very heartening to see that other cataloguing communities all across the world had also encountered the same issue. So Charlotte has just taken this proposal to the November RSC meeting, and we'll hear from her in a second about how it went. So I just wanted to finish up touching base a little bit more on how you can get involved and what resources are out there for you. So number one, what I would absolutely recommend doing, if you haven't done already, is to join the Oceania RDA discussion list. So this is the main tool for RDA discussion in the region. And this is what ORDAC uses for disseminating information about RDA. It's very easy to sign up. It's not full of spam. We won't be spamming you, but it's a very good way to share information. And it's also the easiest way to contact us. We all monitor that list. So if you do email, we will see it. I also want to recommend the ORDAC site on the RDA website. There's a lot of information on there. There's our terms of reference and links to other resources. There is also the RDA YouTube channel. This is full of wonderful videos. Charlotte again has done a great series of training videos, but there's also updates from other regions. So if you're interested in what's happening in, say, North America, or Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, or the rest of Europe, this is your chance to see what's happening. There are also videos of outreach sessions, exploring technical aspects, and a great video on the proposal process as well. I will just finish up here, but I would love to just invite you to think about what it is that you'd like to see from us as your representatives for the Oceania region. And again, just to encourage you to reach out to us for any questions that you do have at the end of today's session or later on in the future. So it is now my absolute pleasure to pass over to Charlotte, who is going to talk about her trip to Washington.
Thank you, Jack. Kia ora, everyone. I'll just wait for Jack to finish sharing and then thanks. share my screen. Okay. Jack, can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yep, it looks great.
Excellent. So yes, I've just returned. I landed back in New Zealand on Monday morning after 4.5 days of meetings hosted by the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So the building on the left on the slide is the Madison Library of Congress building. That's where we had our meetings. Directly across the road is the Jefferson building, and then just a little bit further down the street is Congress. So it's all very central. Some of you may have seen my Outreach Day presentation about the National Library of New Zealand implementation. If not, it is available on the RDA Toolkit YouTube channel. And this was about the experience of implementation. The Outreach Day, this time, we focused on looking at different ways of implementing. So there was also a presentation from Renata Behrens about the German-speaking community's implementation, the DACH community. They have taken a very different approach to the one taken by National Library of New Zealand, and I would definitely recommend watching her presentation as well, just to compare the different methods. In essence, the difference between our two approaches is the Germans have elected to create a resource outside of the main toolkit, which their staff use, whereas National Library of New Zealand have decided to make everything available within the toolkit. And so once you're in the toolkit, everything is there for you to use. Both of the approaches are working. There were training needs and things to be worked out with both approaches. But I think it's a great illustration of how RDA can be made to work for a community. So it's about figuring out what it is you need. The final presentation on the Outreach Day was from the Library of Congress, who are our hosts, or who were our hosts for the last meeting. They are not at the stage of implementation, but they are, of course, the heart of BibFrame, and so they gave a presentation on the current state of BibFrame in relation to RDA. Moving on to the proposals. Thank you, Jack, for the introduction to the ORDAC proposal. This proposal generated a lot of conversation in the RSC this year. It was originally submitted for the April meeting and was discussed there, further discussed in July, and finally voted on in November, and it has passed. So this is just fantastic. And I think I've heard so often from various communities that they can now see that this is really meant to be a standard that serves the needs of communities, and it doesn't matter if the need is only for, or only seems to be for, a single community. It can actually have interest and application elsewhere. So it's worth just raising the matter and having the discussion and being able to get there. So very pleased with that. This should be in place for the February release of the toolkit. Other proposals that were discussed at the meeting, we had the Religions Working Group's second proposal for 2024. In essence, this proposal was similar to ours in that it was filling a gap. And so this was the situation where a corporate body might be known casually as something, but they do actually have an official name. And this allows institutions to say, well, I want to use their official name in this place, not just the one they're colloquially known by. We also had the examples editor put forward a proposal The fictitious entities and non-human entities have always had a guidance chapter in official RDA, but it was noticed that there wasn't, in fact, a definition for these terms in the glossary. And since they have very specific meanings, it was felt that it was useful to actually define those so that there was no confusion. Both of these proposals were also passed through with some discussion, but they have gone through as well. And the final proposal discussed was one put forward by the technical working group. It was their second proposal for the year. And this was a rearrangement of the aggregates guidance within the RDA toolkit. It didn't, in fact, change any of the usage of this guidance. It simply streamlined it and made it easier to read, which is certainly appreciated because it is a difficult concept to wrap your head around. And so, again, this has come through and been approved. There is some further work to come out of this, but this part of it has in fact been passed through at this point. In addition, there was also a discussion paper for this November's meeting. This was a large paper. If any of you saw it when we were circulating it for discussion, it was a very dense read. But it's important to remember that this is a discussion paper and not a proposal. So this was not about voting for decisions. This was about raising issues and for the working group to go away and take on board the advice that had been given to them. And they will come back in the new year with some proposals, perhaps some further discussion if there are points that still need further discussion. It is a difficult paper to read, but it is a very important area to discuss. It looks very complex on the face of it, but actually, when you dig into the detail, it really is a positive shift that's being suggested. And so we very much look forward to seeing how that goes ahead in 2025. So all of the above was covered in the public sessions of the meeting. So what did we do for the rest of the week? During RSC meetings and executive session, we cover annual reports from each of the members. We this time discussed the structure and nature of RSC working groups. This is a very fluid area where we need people to help us outside of the RSC on various topics. I've mentioned the religions working group, there's the examples working group. There is a new archives working group which will be established in early next year. If you're looking at the RSC website and you see a working group is already established and you think you have something to contribute, they are always open to hearing from people, and certainly the archives working group would very much like someone from our region. So please don't think that these working groups are set up and then finished. There is space, and the more international the feedback, the better it is for the standard as a whole. In terms of other things we did, we always look at new and existing relationships with other standards groups. We have connections to IFLA, we have connections to other organisations, and one of the newest ones is we now are working towards a formal agreement with the BibFrame community so that we can provide a mapping between BibFrame and RDA to assist that community. So that's a big development at the moment. There has been some progression on the thinking on the soft deprecated elements. So for those who aren't familiar with this, there are a number of elements in official RDA which aren't strictly necessary. They are already covered by other elements in official RDA, and so they're somewhat redundant. But the decision at the time when the new structure of official RDA was being formed was that they wouldn't immediately remove them. They would wait to see what happened and maybe remove them later. And so we are slowly progressing on what we're going to do with those. But in the meantime, they are still in place. And a very large topic is planning on how the RSC can support communities working on implementation. As Jack said, original RDA is going to be taken down in May 2027. So we need communities thinking about what it is they need to do in order to make this transition. And having reached that point, I think that's a perfect point to bring in our chair. Michela, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte and Jack. My name is Michela Goodwin, and I'm the current chair of ORDAC. I'm also a team member at the National Library of Australia. I'll give you an update on official RDA implementation in New Zealand and Australia, and then we can answer any questions that you might have. I'll start with New Zealand. On the 1st of August of this year, cataloguers at the National Library of New Zealand stopped using original RDA for all resource description. I'll just let that sink in. That is an amazing achievement, and congratulations to New Zealand. So it's a rolling implementation, starting with static resources only and gradually expanding out into other types of materials. The expansion is slow in part because staff are actively testing the instructions and guidance in practice and improving them for clarity to make it easier for other communities. While the National Library of New Zealand is not providing training to other institutions, all documentation is available for other communities to use or modify as suits them. And all training materials are packaged into releases so others can use those as well. The next training package release is during December and is the first part of the practical modules focused on static resources. The National Library of New Zealand approach is to house all guidance and supporting materials within the toolkit, providing a streamlined experience for cataloguers. The result of applying National Library of New Zealand policies and guidance looks very similar to data found in previous records, but with a strong focus on being able to distinguish which element a value represents, even though data is still encoded using Mark 21. Questions on the National Library of New Zealand approach are welcomed and can always be sent to the National Library at nznb@dia.gov.New Zealand. In terms of the implementation process, it has been the experience at the National Library of New Zealand that a focus on RDA first and encoding second has provided the best clarity for cataloguers and is worth the effort, as it means cataloguers are prepared for any change in the future in encoding, such as a shift from Mark to XML or BibFrame. Focusing on RDA means that if those changes occur, there should be no new RDA training required at that point, which means the National Library of New Zealand cataloguers are better prepared for new data exchange possibilities. And now where Australia is at. First, we listened to the National Library of New Zealand and learned from their journey and what they found worked well and not so well. This is a mammoth task, and we realised very quickly that we could harness the success of NASLA-led collaborations, such as the National E-Deposit, also known as NED, and the First Nations Description Guidelines projects, and run this collaboratively under the strong leadership of NASLA. How to do this? Well, a national project to understand the use, challenges, and resources of transition into official RDA within the Australian library sector was led by Melissa Parent over a 3-month period, which ended in September. Melissa consulted with the library and information sector in Australia to understand the use, extent, and needs of RDA practitioners. who are going to be most affected by the transition from original RDA to official RDA as of May 2027. Some people here online may have contributed and provided valuable feedback through emails and one-on-one interviews. Melissa wasn't alone. She worked with a steering group of representatives from NASLA, IATSIS, ALIA, ACORD, CALL and CAVAL, with strong leadership from Dr. Simon Paulson, the NASLA Executive Director. The report and its proposed next steps with a clear path forward was considered by the NASLA advisory groups before its delivery to the NASLA board, with a meeting being held next week to discuss the report and its recommendations. You might now be wondering how you can stay up to date with the transition to official RDA in Australia and find out how you can be part of the project. Easy. Just head to the NASLA website and sign up to the newsletter. You can also read about what has already happened in the project to date on that website. I'm going to add to Jack and Charlotte's messages about ORDAC, RDA and RSC. Please be part of RDA and have your voice heard. Provide feedback. You might want to join ORDAC. Where possible, keep an eye on the RDA toolkit for news and webinars. We need motivated and open-minded colleagues to join us. Charlotte played down how influential she was in convincing Europe and the USA to listen to the Oceania perspective and to successfully advocate for change. Finally, ORDAC is planning on holding more webinars like this one, and we would love to hear from you on any ideas for future presentations you might have. Send us an email via the Oceania RDA discussion list. And lastly, thank you so much for listening. And now, any questions?
So far, there's only been one question come through on the chat, which was, is there an education working group or consideration to form one? I know there is an education and orientation officer at the RSC, but Charlotte, has that discussion come up at RSC at any time?
To date, there is no intention for there to be an education working group. It's the education and orientation officer position was initially envisaged by the RSC to be a short-term position. That was confirmed earlier this year as a permanent role because there is so much need there. And Elisa is shortly going to release some generic training slides for LIS educators to use and change as they need to. There was a little bit of discussion about whether that role may need some further support, but at this stage, no, it is simply a single position. Elisa can be contacted directly if you have questions about training at that very high level. And her contact details are on the RSC's website. Otherwise, if you're thinking more locally about training, it's probably better to talk to either NASLA if you're in Australia, to CATSIG or to National Library of New Zealand if you're in New Zealand. And of course, ORDAC can field any questions if you're not quite sure where to send something to.
We have a question also in the Q&A part. When, if ever, will there be a user-friendly plain English version of official RDA?
That's a great question. And I think that's where the people on this call and other cataloguers around can take part in shaping that. And that's, putting your voice into ORDAC, being part of the National Library of New Zealand's implementation, giving feedback. speaking to NASLA to be part of this project, because the policy statements, the application profiles that we will add and create is what's there to make it easier, clearer, and more specific to the regions that we live and work in.
If I may add to that, Michela, I think it's worth acknowledging that the language of the toolkit is tough. It's filled with jargon, but it's also fair to say that so was AACR too, and so is MARC, and so are the other standards that we may encounter. And this happens in other professions and other fields. So while it is challenging when you're first encountering this jargon, committing to learning the jargon means that it actually becomes easier as you go on. And it's been our experience at National Library of New Zealand that the more experienced the cataloguer and the more standards they've been exposed to, the harder it is to learn this new material, because you've already got all of that information in your head and you're translating one term to another. Whereas when you're dealing with people who are striking it for the first time, who've had minimal exposure to cataloguing in the past, they simply learn the new terms and accept them for what they are and go on. So while it is challenging and you have to acknowledge that challenge, it is worth it and it does get easier.
Nan, you've got your hand up. See if you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, you can add a question either in chat or in the Q&A. Okay, not hearing anything at the moment, but I do have another question that has come in. Will there be a controlled vocabularies for dual names?
I'll pick up that one if you like. No, there is no intention for there to be a specific vocabulary. The changes made in terms of new options to the toolkit simply mean that if you have the information that an organization prefers the full string and always refers to itself by the full string, then you can use the full string instead of trying to break it up. And it is going to come down to what it is you're describing. If you're describing a place, very often there's a gazetteer, and the gazetteer will tell you what the form is. And in situations such as Uluru is rock, it will give you both names. Now that may change over time as the gazetteer entry changes, but at the current point in time, it will tell you that both of these names should be used together, meaning a single place. And that's true of corporate body names in some situations. It does not necessarily impact on the authorized access point. There's a lot of complexity as to why that may be. This is about when you're at the stage of working out what the organization prefers to call itself. And so how it appears in your record is a different set of decisions than making this choice at this point. It may well be that there is already an authority record for the organization you're talking about, and it simply doesn't acknowledge the name in that way.
A question for Michela. Is the NASLA report available publicly yet, or does that happen at a later date?
That will be released, I believe, on the NASLA website at the discretion of Dr. Simon Paulson. But that'll be later once the NASLA board meeting has occurred.
Any further questions? I can't see anything in either chat or in the Q&A at the moment. I might just add that I don't seem to be able to get my acronyms around the right way at this point in time. It's NLNZ. I think I've tried about every different permutation there is.
And as we mentioned earlier, if you come up with a question later on, we do invite you to contact us through that discussion list, and we'll get back to you there.
Okay, panelists, that seems to be all the questions that are coming through at the moment. I actually have one, Charlotte, for you. To note that the RSC is looking a memorandum of understanding with BibFrame. Just wondering which flavour of BibFrame, or wasn't that discussed?
It was discussed. I don't have those notes with me right at this moment, but the agreement hasn't yet been signed. So once the agreement is signed, there'll be a formal announcement of that. It may also be in the official minutes, which should be out in the next week or so from this meeting.
Great, thank you.
Well,
any further questions?
If that's that, I'd like to really thank Jamie Henley for being up late in his evening to make this happen for us. The significant advantage of getting Jamie up in his evening is that we can put these recordings out on the RDA Toolkit website so that they're easily accessible to anyone interested in RDA. So we're very grateful for that. And thank you everyone for attending.